Wisteria, energy, twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Encyclopedia of Faeries. We're still in the sea, but the Ceffyl Dwar. The Ceffyl Dwar is a Welsh water horse, so it's generally like a kelpie, which is also a water horse. Can be found in lakes and rivers and is very dangerous because it will take you to your death. Now we're on changelings. A changeling is a fairy or enchanted object that is swapped for a living human, or is stolen by the fairies. If the changeling was a fairy, it was usually said to be an old fairy who wished to be doted on by humans, although in some cases it was said that the changeling was a sickly fairy baby and wasn't wanted by its fairy parents. 1911. If the changeling wasn't a fairy, then the alternative was that it would be an inanimate object, often a stick or a log, which was made to appear like the missing person using fairy magic. Once the living human had been taken and replaced, the changeling would seem to sicken and eventually die, or at least seem to die, and would be buried by the human family who believed the person had died. An example of this pattern is found in the Cornish tale of Selina Moore, where the woman Grace Hutchins says that while she lived on after being taken by the fairies, a family buried what she assumed was a changeling. Although the most common belief has been that the person themselves was taken, usually physically, and replaced, there have been few alternate theories over the last 100 years to explain them. During the Victorian period, some occultists come to believe that changelings were not a swapping out of physical beings, but rather a type of possession, where the human would be overtaken by a fairy spirit. In the 20th and 21st centuries, anthropology changelings were, and still are often viewed as attempts by folklore to explain medical conditions, particularly those that affect behaviours such as autism. For the Victorians, the concept seemed to be rooted in an overreaching idea that the person's body remained, but their spirit could not be taken and replaced, creating the changeling phenomena. While for later anthropologists and some folklorists, the premise was that fairies did not exist, as there must be a physical explanation that caused the belief. The primary targets for fairy abductions were babies, new brides, and new mothers, particularly those with a mild temperament who were considered attractive. Good physical health was also a prerequisite in most cases, and there is at least one account of a woman who was being taken by the fairies who was left after she sneezed. The greatest times of risk for a human were liminal periods such as birth or marriage, with babies and children up to the age 8 or 9 being at high risk, and a woman in childbearing years being in equal danger. Other popular targets for abduction included new mothers who might be taken to wet nurse fairy babies, and may or may not be kept permanently or later returned. Not all converted humans were necessarily stolen, as we see groups including midwives and musicians borrowed but returned, whereas babies, children, and some adults were taken permanently. Those replaced with changelings were those who the good folk intended to keep, with the changelings used to deceive the human family into believing the person was dead. There are many theories as to why fairies take humans, but no definitive answers. One of the main theories is that the fairies steal people in order to supplement their own numbers. This idea usually hinges on the related belief that the good people reproduce rarely and with difficulty, and that they must therefore look to outside sources like humans to strengthen their own population. The tale of Selina Moore would seem to affirm this, where the human captive Grace Hutchins affirms that the Cornish fairies take humans and turn them into fairies, but also says that the fairy folk do rarely have their own babies and make much of such births. Human babies then are taken to be made into fairies, and human women to be used as breeding stock to produce hybrid children, or children who may be turned fully into fairies. This is seen particularly in a variety of stories about stolen brides, as well as stories of borrowed midwives, where the midwife is taken by the fairy man to the bedside of his wife only to find herself delivering the child of a human girl she recognises, but that everyone thought had died. Another belief was that fairy babies were usually ugly, and so fairies coveted beauty human babies would exchange one for the other. They seem to prefer people who are in some way deviant or have broken societal rules, This can be seen in both anecdotal evidence, where people taken are usually out alone when or where they should not be, or have failed to follow the usual protocol for protection, or in ballads and folk tales, where people are taken while in or near liminal places. On the one hand, this can represent one way in which people often themselves up to being taken, but it could also represent a deeper underlying motivation in which perhaps the people are being taken because they have some quality that the fae folk either admire or need more of themselves. This, of course, is predicated on the idea that changelings are left in place of people taken for some, at least nominally, possessive use. However, it's worth noting that not all theories of the fairy abduction are benevolent, by even the most lenient standard. If one favours the idea of 10 to hell as an actual teeth that occurs, and in humans can be used as substitutes for fairies, then arguably people may be taken to be offered to dark spirits, so that the fairies themselves may be spared. Means of identifying a suspected changeling often involve tricking it into revealing itself. In some cases, the changeling was said to be one of the good people who magically appeared to be the human, but usually acted very differently. If it was a baby who had been taken, the replacement would typically be sickly, constantly hungry, impossible to please, while an adult who was taken might display equally dramatic personality changes. A person who had previously been kind and gentle might become cross and cruel, while a child who had before been pleasant and easy-tempered would suddenly be mean-spirited and demanding. This may be done through careful observation, such as the story of the mother who noted that when she was with her child, the baby would cry ceaselessly, but when alone in her room, the baby would fall silent, and the mother outside the room could hear music. A Scottish story along similar lines involved a changeling infant who was seen playing straw-like bagpipes, or in a variant was seen playing a reed for the other fairies to dance to. In older folklore, a variety of tricks are suggested, including boiling water in an eggshell, which, in the tales, will cause the changeling to sit up and declare that, as ancient as it has never seen such a thing before. A regional variant involves disposing of ashes in eggshells. A family could also seek the advice of a wise person or a fairy doctor to assess a suspected changeling and confirm or deny its fairy nature. Generally, if the presence of a changeling was confirmed, every attempt was then made to regain the human child. Only in very rare cases was the family advised to treat the changeling well and accept it in their family, with the idea that treating it well would earn good treatment for their own child in fairy. There is at least one late 19th century Manx account of a changeling where the child taken was a much older boy, but he was successfully recovered. The account is as follows. 40 to 50 years ago, between St. John's and Foxdale, a boy, with whom I often played, came to our house at nightfall to borrow some candles, and while he was on his way home across the hills he suddenly saw a little boy and a little woman coming after him. If he ran, they ran, and all the time they gained on him. Upon reaching home he was speechless. His hands were altered, turned awry, and his feet also, and his fingernails had grown long in a minute. He remained this way a week. My father went to the boy's mother and told her it wasn't Robbie at all that she saw, and when my father was for taking the tongs and burning the boy with a piece of glowing turf as a changeling test, the boy screamed awfully. Then my father persuaded the mother to send a messenger to a doctor in the north near Ramsey, doing charms, to see if she couldn't get Robbie back. As the messenger was returning, the mother stepped out of the house to relieve him, and when she went into the house again, her own Robbie was there. As soon as Robbie came to himself all right, he said a little woman and a little boy had followed him, and that just as he got home he was conscious of being taken away by them, but he didn't know where they came from, nor where they took him. He was unable to tell more than this. Robbie is alive yet, and as far as I know, he's fine. This account is of particular interest because the person giving it knew the child was not taken, both before and after, and was aware of the events as they occurred. It also illustrates the interplay of folklore and belief with the events as they were progressing during the boy's experience. Because the fear of changelings and more generally of losing a person to the good people was so persuasive and, well, there were protective methods against it because they believed that you couldn't persuade them to do it. You would have to protect yourself or force it, if that makes any sense. Looking at protections as an array of options, beginning with prohibitions against verbally complimenting an infant, lest the words attract the fairies' attention and increase the chance of the child being taken. Although in some contexts red was seen to be a fairy colour, it was also used as protection against the fairies, something we see more generally in the use of red thread, with Rowan. There is at least some anecdotal evidence of the use of red flannel pinned to children's clothes as a way to keep them from being taken. In Wales, early baptism was common because of the belief that a Christian baptism was to protect an infant from being taken. So widespread that they might be termed ambiguous were belief in the power of iron or steel, and particularly of keeping scissors, a knife, a fire poker or tongs over or near the cradle. Other commonly found protections include burning leather in the room, keeping bread nearby, fire, silver, giving the woman and child milk from a cow who had eaten the herb mutton, and being carefully and perpetually watched. In many stories, it is but a moment's intention or an adult falling asleep that allow the changeling swap to happen, compounded by a lack of any other protection in place. I will warn the reader before we get into this section that often the means of forcing a changeling to leave were brutal and could be fatal to the person on the receiving end. There were just as many methods of forcing a changeling to leave as there are as protection. To force a changeling to leave usually involved threatening or harming them, most commonly with iron or fire. Bridget Clearer was a woman in Ireland who died in 1895 when her husband and several family members and neighbours burned her alive after several days of trying to cure her, believing that she was actually a fairy who had been taken. It was a fairy who had taken the real place, which we've done the story already. Before being killed, she was forced to drink herbal concoctions. She was doused in urine. She was jabbed repeatedly with hot iron pokers, as well as having a priest come in and say mass over her. After several days of this, she was set on fire and eventually died of her burns. Think about that. That is a really horrendous way to die. A piece of iron might be thrown at the changeling, or in one or more benign rituals, salt can be placed on a shovel blade, marked with a cross, and heated in a fire, with a window left open near the changeling. The changeling might be beaten, pelted with refuse, and animal dung. So as you can see, to spot a changeling and bring back a changeling, I'm not going to go into any more because basically it's horrible, it's horrendous, okay? They have to be really tortured and beaten, as we saw in Bridget's case, where she died from what they did to her. And, you know, usually early in the centuries, if this ever happened, yeah, the person would generally die from the way they were trying to get their child back or the person back. That's just how it was. Anyway, thank you for listening to this episode of The Fair Folk, and I'm sorry that the Changelings is so brutal, but I mean, that's the truth of it. It's brutal, and if it were ever done back then, they usually didn't die, you know, because if it wasn't a changeling, there's nothing to bring back, therefore you're just murdering your family member, you know, and that's just how it was. But yeah, very, 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 very cruel. Many blessings.
Wisteria. Energy. Twister.